Okay, welcome to the deep dive. Get ready, because today we are cracking open something truly extraordinary. We've got a stack of source material here that promises to completely challenge everything you thought you knew about the fundamental rules of the universe, gravity, space, time, even the very idea of what a body is.
It's pretty ambitious stuff.
Absolutely. And this whole wild, mind-bending journey, it's happening because you, our incredible listener, shared this fascinating research with us, so thank you for that.
That's right. It is absolutely not every day that we get to dive into a system that proposes such a fundamentally different, almost, well, the author uses the word unrecognizable, view of the physical world.
Unrecognizable, I love that.
Yeah. The material you've provided lays out something the author calls Russian mechanics by Anatoly Fyodorovich Chernyaev. And it's a significant departure from the physics frameworks most of us are familiar with, from Newton all the way through quantum mechanics.
Absolutely. So you gave us these texts, and our mission today together is to plunge headfirst into these concepts. We're going to explore the core ideas presented by the author, try to understand the logic behind this potentially unrecognizable physical world they propose, and see how they claim it offers a truly unified picture of nature, linking everything from the smallest particle to the largest galaxy. It's all based on your sources, and we're your guides.
It's a compelling mission. We're going to navigate through ideas that are, let's be honest, at face value, in direct contradiction with established physics. But our goal is simple. Present them clearly, explore their internal logic, see what picture emerges, and understand the picture of the cosmos that emerges from this material. No judgment, just exploration, curiosity.
Exactly. Think of this deep dive as your express pass to getting a handle on a radical alternative perspective on reality. It's complex, it's definitely dense.
Oh, yeah.
But we're going to make it understandable, engaging, and maybe even throw in a laugh or two, because honestly, some of this stuff is just wonderfully weird.
It definitely has its moments.
And hey, if you're fascinated by peeling back the layers on topics that challenge the status quo, make sure you like, subscribe, and definitely hit that notification bell. Join us for all our future deep dives into the unexpected.
All right, shall we dive in? Let's unpack this.
Let's do it. Where do we even begin to set the stage for a system like this? It starts with a fundamental critique of classical mechanics, right? The physics most of us kind of grew up learning in school.
Yeah, that's the starting point.
So what's the author's main beef with this standard view?
Well, the author starts by arguing that classical physics, while incredibly successful at describing how things behave in many situations, predicting trajectories, forces.
Sure, it works for building bridges and stuff.
Exactly. But fundamentally, they argue, it breaks down nature into disconnected, simplified parts. Think about it. Mass and force are treated as independent concepts, only linked together during an interaction, like when you push something, the classic EVMA.
Right. Force equals mass times acceleration, two separate things linked by math.
Exactly. And the author sees this fragmentation as a major flaw. Nature, in their view, isn't just a collection of separate pieces doing their own thing until they bump into each other. It's presented as an integrated whole.
So it's like looking at a forest, but only seeing individual trees and the pushes and pulls between them, like wind or falling branches, rather than seeing the entire interconnected ecosystem, the soil, the roots, the air.
That's a really good analogy, yeah. And a key part of this perceived fragmentation, according to the source material, stems from a surprising place. A lack of clear definitions right at the very beginning, like foundational stuff.
Okay. Like what?
The author notes that even foundational figures like Isaac Newton didn't clearly define what a body is.
Wait, Newton didn't define what a body is? That seems incredibly basic. How can you build laws of motion without defining the thing that's moving?
It does seem basic, doesn't it? And the author argues this ambiguity leads to all sorts of confusion down the line. The term body gets conflated, mixed up with other concepts like matter, substance, energy, or mass.
I guess we do tend to use those interchangeably sometimes.
We often intuitively think of a body as its mass, right? That feels like its most defining property, how much stuff it has.
Yeah, that feels like the most fundamental thing. Its inertia, its resistance to being moved.
But from the perspective of Russian mechanics, that's precisely the confusion they're pointing out. Mass, they argue, is just one property of a body. It's no more or less fundamental than its length, its density, its velocity, even its temperature, perhaps. A body is something much more complex than just its mass or the substance it happens to be made of.
Okay, so mass is demoted from king property to just one member of the property council. Interesting. So fragmentation and fuzzy definitions are strikes 1 and 2 against classical physics. What else is on the author's critique list?
Well, the author also points out the postulatory nature of classical physics, especially Newton's laws. These laws are built on axioms, statements accepted as true because they work, because they accurately predict observable phenomena.
Right. They give the right answers in experiments.
Exactly. They're incredibly useful tools, no question. But they're not necessarily based on a deeply verified, unified understanding of the underlying reality. The author suggests it's more of a descriptive system, a really good one, but not necessarily an explanatory one at the most fundamental level. Why do these axioms hold true? Classical physics often doesn't ask that deeply.
It's like having a perfect recipe that always works, maybe passed down through generations, but you don't actually understand the chemistry of why the flour and eggs and heat interact precisely the way they do to make the cake rise. You just know the recipe works.
It's a perfect analogy, and the author suggests that because of these fundamental issues, the fragmentation, the fuzzy definitions, the postulatory basis, the physical world described by this Russian mechanics system is fundamentally, and here's that word again, unrecognizable when compared to the standard orthodox view we're taught. It's a different reality picture.
An unrecognizable universe. That's quite a claim. Before we fully jump into this new world, though, the author gives a little nod back in time, right? To Aristotle. That seems like an unusual reference point for modern physics.
Yes, which is quite interesting. The author acknowledges Aristotle's physics. Now, obviously, it reflects the limitations of ancient knowledge. It got many things wrong by modern standards. But Aristotle's system is seen here as having a certain enduring value.
Really? Like what, leeches and phlogiston?
Not quite. It's more about the approach. Aristotle's system was a rigorous, comprehensive, qualitative picture of the world. It wasn't primarily about precise measurements and mathematical calculations in the way modern physics is, but it offered a more integrated, systemic view. Everything had its natural place, its purpose, its connections.
Okay, so less numbers, more. Holistic description.
Exactly. And the author suggests that this qualitative, systemic sense still holds some relevance today, especially when contrasted with what they see as the fragmented modern picture. Maybe physics lost something important when it gained all that quantitative precision.
So the idea might be that physics gained mathematical power, but maybe lost the sense of nature as a unified qualitative system, like seeing the code but not the poetry.
That seems to be the implication, yes. And Russian mechanics seems to aim to build a system that is both quantitative and unified, perhaps recapturing some of that lost systemic understanding from ancient views, but within a modern mathematical framework, discarding the outdated specifics of Aristotle, of course.
All right, that sets the stage. If classical physics doesn't even clearly define a body, the most basic unit, how does Russian mechanics handle it? What is the fundamental building block in this new, unrecognizable system?
Right, they have to start somewhere concrete. And this system starts with a very clear and quite powerful definition. According to the source, a body is a natural object that manifests its existence through certain interconnected properties.
I like that.
It feels active. It sounds like the properties aren't just passive labels we stick on a body. They're how it actually is. They are its essence, its being. And this is an absolutely crucial conceptual shift from the standard view. The source material emphasizes that these properties like mass, yes, but also velocity, acceleration, energy, even the gravitational constant g, which they argue isn't constant.
Well, hold on. G isn't constant. We'll definitely need to circle back to that.
Oh, we will. But the point is, all these properties and many others, they don't just describe the body from the outside like paint on a car. They belong to the body. They are intrinsic to it, existing and defining the body, regardless of whether we are observing or measuring them. They are described as absolute properties of the body itself.
Absolute properties, intrinsic, belonging to the body. Okay. And you mentioned something surprising about them earlier when we were prepping, something about direction, anisotropic.
Yes. That's another layer. The author claims these intrinsic properties can be different depending on the direction you're considering within the body. Anisotropic means direction dependent.
So like wood grain, easier to split along the grain than across it.
Exactly like wood grain, but potentially applying to things like mass or how it responds to force. Imagine something isn't uniformly dense, or maybe doesn't resist a push the same way if you push it from the side versus from the top. That suggests its properties like mass or inertia could vary anisotropically.
Whoa. Okay, so the mass of my coffee cup sitting right here might be slightly different if I measure it side to side versus top to bottom in some fundamental intrinsic way. My mind is already starting to bend a little.
It certainly challenges our intuitive notion of objects being uniform, asotropic spheres, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And in this system, all these intrinsic, potentially anisotropic properties are described as interrelated, they affect each other, they're seen as equally significant in defining the body, they're quantitatively changeable, their values can change, and they possess dimensionality, like length, time, mass, etc. It's a much richer, more complex internal description of any physical object than standard physics typically uses.
Interrelated, equally significant, changeable, anisotropic. It's like every object is its own little universe of complex, direction-dependent properties. And this leads to a truly radical claim about uniqueness, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Because a body is defined by this entire unique set of intrinsic, interrelated, potentially anisotropic properties, the author states quite clearly, no two bodies in nature are identical, period, full stop.
Not even.
Not even what we think of as identical elementary particles, like two electrons or two protons. And in this view, they'll always differ in some subtle way, perhaps just in their precise state of pulsation, their exact velocity, their orientation relative to the ether, the specific values of their properties.
So my two electrons that QM says are indistinguishable. They're not. Each electron is its own unique individual snowflake in the universe, every single particle.
That's the picture the source paints. A universe populated by truly unique entities at every single level, each defined by its complex intrinsic dynamic properties. No copies.
That's kind of profound, actually. A universe of individuals. And if everything is unique and defined by these complex properties, what happens when you try to break it down, like splitting an atom or bombarding a particle? Does this system believe in truly indivisible fundamental particles like quarks or something, the ultimate Lego bricks?
No, it challenges that fundamental building block idea as well. The author argues that even if you bombard and attempt to divide a body, you never reach some ultimate indivisible remains. There's no final layer.
So no fundamental particles.
The process of division, they suggest, is endless. You can keep finding smaller and smaller structures, potentially to infinity, both inwards and outwards. There's always more complexity, more structure within structure. They use an analogy of people shrinking as they walk toward the center of a sphere. They'd never actually reach it. Similarly, expanding outwards is also seen as an endless process of encountering larger structures.
Infinite complexity, scales within scales, forever inwards and outwards. Wow, that's a humbling thought. It's not just about finding the smallest bit. It's about understanding structure at endless levels, a potentially infinite fractal reality.
It replaces the idea of fundamental, indivisible particles, the ultimate constituents, with a picture of infinite, structured complexity and interrelatedness at all scales.
Okay, this is already altering the landscape significantly, and this brings us to what feels like a central pillar of Russian mechanics, this concept of self-motion, or pulsation. This seems to be a type of movement that goes way beyond just moving from point A to point B, or spinning like a top.
Absolutely. This is perhaps the most fundamentally different type of motion introduced by this system, and it seems to underpin almost everything else. The core idea is that all bodies in nature, from the largest celestial objects down to atoms and molecules, are in a constant state of intrinsic movement the author calls pulsation.
Pulsation, like a heartbeat, or more like a high-frequency vibration. What does that mean physically?
It's described as a third fundamental type of motion, distinct from linear translation, moving in a line, or rotation, spinning. It's motion relative to themselves, an internal dynamic, a constant rhythmic change in their properties, perhaps their size, their field strength, but it's also motion relative to space, the ether, and other bodies, because their properties are constantly changing as they pulsate.
So that rock on the ground isn't just sitting there passively, it's internally shimmering, vibrating, pulsating. My desk is pulsating. I'm pulsating.
That's the claim. Everything has this intrinsic rhythm, and this pulsation isn't just a passive state like a bell ringing after being struck. It requires and expends energy. It's an active process. And according to the author, the work performed by this pulsation is what defines the body's state and its position in space. It's the engine of its existence, constantly maintaining its form and properties through this dynamic activity.
Wow. Okay. So energy isn't just something you use for motion, like accelerating a car. It's constantly being used by this fundamental internal motion that defines the body itself. That's a very different view of energy. And this intrinsic pulsation is key to another surprising claim, something about wave properties.
It is. This is a central assertion of this system, flowing directly from pulsation. Because all bodies are constantly pulsating, changing rhythmically, they all possess wave properties, not just light, not just electrons and quantum mechanics, everything.
Wait, Everything. So my car has wave properties. This microphone has wave properties. Like I have a wavelength.
According to Russian mechanics, yes. You, me, the car, the microphone, all possess wave properties due to this fundamental pulsation.
But we don't see things behaving like waves in everyday life. My car doesn't diffract around corners.
And the author explicitly contrasts this with classical physics, which denies this pulsation and wave nature for macroscopic objects like that car or microphone. They argue classical physics does this without sufficient justification, simply because no one tried to measure it seriously, or perhaps because the framework didn't allow for it. It was just assumed away for big things.
So it's an unexamined assumption.
But that's the suggestion. They do note that quantum mechanics is, interestingly, somewhat undecided on the pulsation of elementary particles. They mention Paul Dirac's description of an electron's inherent motion as Zitterbewegung, often translated as trembling motion or shivering.
Dirac's shivering electron. That fits right in with this pulsation idea, doesn't it?
It seems to resonate, yes. So this pulsation is presented as the universal engine that gives everything its wave nature and defines its state through constant energy expenditure. It's a fundamental property woven into the fabric of every single body in this model of the universe. It appears to be presented as the driving force behind much of what we observe, the underlying dynamic reality.
Now, if all bodies are constantly moving and pulsating, interacting, they must be interacting through something. They can't just be pulsating in a void, can they? This is where the old, seemingly discarded idea of ether comes roaring back into play.
Absolutely. This is a major divergence from Einstein's relativity in modern physics. It's a cornerstone of Russian mechanics. The assertion that space is not an empty vacuum. In this framework, space is formed by a substantive ether, a material medium that has structure and properties.
Ether. Wow, I definitely thought that went out the window with the Michelson-Morley experiment and Einstein's special theory of relativity declaring space empty and relative motion being key.
That's the standard narrative, absolutely.
Yeah.
The author acknowledges Einstein's work in this context, but argues that declaring space empty was perhaps a premature step, maybe based on misinterpreting experiments or focusing only on certain aspects. The concept of a substantive ether, a medium filling space, has been part of descriptions of nature since ancient Greece, and this system resurrects it, not as a static, passive backdrop, but as the dynamic, structured, very fabric of space itself.
Okay, so space is made of something real, this ether. What's it like? Does the author describe its structure? Is it just like a uniform, invisible jello filling everything?
No, definitely not uniform. That's crucial. It's described as having a porous or cellular structure, almost like a foam, but organized into various ranked levels or scales. Think nested hierarchies.
Levels, like what?
The author provides a hierarchical list, and it's meant to extend both incredibly far out and incredibly far in. Universe level, galaxy group level, galaxy level, star system level, celestial body level like Earth, molecules level, atoms level, and they state this continues potentially to infinity in both directions. Deeper structures within particles, larger structures beyond galaxy clusters.
So cosmic bubbles within bubbles. Endlessly nested, almost like a fractal structure for space itself. That's quite a picture.
It is, and these ranked levels are separated by what the author calls neutral layers or zones, kind of like boundaries or transition regions between the different scales of ether cells.
Neutral zones between scales. Why are those important?
An important point from the source is that cells within one level are said to barely affect cells of other levels. There's a degree of isolation. This, they argue, allows for the relative independence we observe between different scales of nature.
Ah, okay. That makes intuitive sense. The physics happening inside an atom doesn't seem to directly dictate the movement of entire galaxies, even if the underlying laws are related. There's a buffer.
Precisely. However, and this is key to the unification aspect they're aiming for, the author claims that the same fundamental laws operate at all these different levels. They just manifest differently depending on the scale and the specific properties, like density maybe, of the ether at that particular level.
Same laws, different appearances.
Exactly. They give examples. Coulomb's law describes electrical interactions effectively at the atomic level, within the atomic ether zone. Newton's law of attraction, they say, works well for describing interactions within a star system in its specific ether zone. But crucially, the author stresses that Newton's law, in this context, is not seen as a universal law applying identically across all levels, from atoms to galaxy clusters. Its form might be similar, but the parameters, like G, might change.
So The fundamental rules are the same everywhere, but how we describe them or the constants involved change depending on whether you're inside an atom's tiny ether cell or swimming in a galaxy's enormous ether zone. That's a neat way to handle scale.
That's the idea. And the ether isn't just a static fill like insulation. The source says it forms space. It is space. And it also accompanies central bodies as they move. It's not something bodies move through so much as a structure they carry with them.
Wait, carry with them?
Yes. The ether zone surrounding Earth, for instance, moves along with our planet through the larger solar system ether zone, which moves with the sun through the galactic ether zone, and so on.
So Earth isn't just cruising through empty space or even a static ether. It's dragging its own personal bubble of structured cellular ether along with it, like a personalized gravitational force field, but made of actual ether.
Something very much like that, yes. It's called ether entrainment or dragging. And the author introduces the concept of a supermolecule as a characteristic structure, a kind of pattern or building block that is repeated across all these levels, from the grandest galaxy down to the tiniest elementary particle. It's like a universal structural blueprint found at every scale within the ether.
A supermolecule structure. The same basic pattern showing up at every scale, built from this dynamic cellular hierarchical ether. It's a serious attempt to provide a consistent physical picture of space itself, from the infinitely small to the infinitely large.
It provides a framework for understanding how structure and laws can be consistent across vastly different scales, which is a major puzzle in standard physics.
Okay, my head is buzzing with pulsating bodies and structured ether. Now, if space isn't empty but made of this active substantive stuff, how does that fundamentally change our understanding of a force like gravity? This feels like where things could get really wild.
Oh, this is absolutely where it gets really juicy, and perhaps most counterintuitive to our standard training. The author presents a truly radical idea about gravity. Forget pulling.
Forget pulling, but gravity pulls things together. Apples fall down.
Not in this system. The author proposes that gravitation isn't necessarily an intrinsic attraction between masses pulling each other across empty space. Instead, it might be a consequence of ether pressure pushing bodies together. The Russian term used is athuk, which translates very specifically to pushing towards or pressing towards.
Pushing towards, not pulling together. So the apple isn't pulled down to the earth. It's pushed down by the ether pressure around it, maybe less pressure below it near the earth.
That's the dramatic conceptual flip. It's pressure from the ambient substantive ether. And interestingly, the author notes that Isaac Newton himself, later in his life, apparently considered this possibility. He wondered if gravity might be caused by some external pressure mechanism in a non-empty space, rather than an inherent pull.
Newton himself considered gravity by pushing. Wow, okay. So what we experience as the downward pull of gravity is actually the dynamic pressure of the surrounding ether medium squeezing us towards the center of the Earth.
That's the system's explanation. The ether pressure is perhaps slightly different in different locations or directions around a massive body, leading to a net push. And just as the overall ether structure has those neutral zones between different scales, atom level, planet level, etc., the author suggests neutral zones also exist within gravitational fields themselves.
Neutral gravity zones, like Lagrange points.
Possibly related, but described differently here. These occur where the ether zones of two gravitating bodies coincide and balance out, like perhaps somewhere between the Earth and the Sun. These zones are described as being formed by ether zones of equal density pushing from opposing directions, resulting in a point or region of zero net gravitational push.
A gravitational balance zone created by opposing ether pressures.
Okay.
That makes a kind of sense. And is this pressure constant, like air pressure, or is it related to that fundamental pulsation we talked about?
Ah, you anticipated it.
Yeah.
It's absolutely related to their fundamental motion. Gravitational attraction, or rather pushing together, is described explicitly as a pulsating interaction between mutually gravitating bodies driven by their intrinsic pulsation.
Pulsation, again, it really is central. So gravity is like bodies rhythmically pushing on the ether around them, maybe creating pressure waves, and that interaction causes them to be pushed towards each other.
Yeah.
A pulsating push instead of a steady pull.
That's the proposed mechanism. The pulsation of one body affects the ether, which affects the other pulsating body. And the author provides a modified formula for the law of attraction to reflect this pulsation dynamic. It looks familiar at first glance. F GMM1R2, but there's a crucial addition.
Okay, math alert. Let's hear it.
The proposed formula is F equals GMM1 cos E1R2. See that cosine term? Cosine E minus E1.
Cosine of E minus E1. What are E and E1?
E and E1 represent the phase of the pulsation of the two interacting bodies, body M and body M1. The cosine term accounts for the phase difference between their pulsations. Are they pulsating in sync, out of sync, or somewhere in between?
Okay, so the strength of gravity depends not just on mass and distance, but on whether the two objects are dancing to the same rhythm. What does that phase difference actually do physically in the formula?
This is the truly mind-blowing part. The cosine function, as you know, can range from +1 to -1. If the two bodies are pulsating perfectly in sync, phase difference is 0, or a multiple of 360 degrees, then cos1 equals +1, and the formula just looks like standard Newtonian attraction, F equals GMM1R2.
Okay, so in-sync pulsation gives us normal gravity. What if they're out of sync?
What if they are perfectly out of phase, meaning their phase difference is 180 degrees? What's the cosine of 180 degrees?
-1.
Exactly. If they are perfectly out of phase, cos E1 becomes -1, and the force F becomes negative. F equals GMM1R2.
Negative force, that means repulsion. They push apart.
Precisely. This system explicitly predicts that bodies can repel each other gravitationally, based simply on the phase relationship of their internal pulsations. The author calls this phenomenon anti-gravitation.
Anti-gravitation is a direct consequence of their internal rhythm being out of step, just like that. Pulsate together, you attract. Pulsate opposite, you repel. That's definitely not in the standard physics textbook. That's huge.
It's a truly radical departure from classical gravity, which is only ever attractive. And the implications of gravity being an ether-mediated pressure interaction driven by pulsation go even further. If gravity is a wave-like pressure phenomenon in a medium,
then maybe you can interfere with it, block it.
Exactly. Contrary to standard general relativity, which generally says you can't shield gravity, the author claims gravitational fields can be screened. They describe an experiment reportedly conducted by the author in the late 1970s.
An actual experiment.
So the text claims, in this experiment, a rotating hollow disk allegedly caused a measurable increase in weight for an object placed inside a stationary box within the rotating disk.
Wait, hang on. A spinning disk made something heavier inside it. Not lighter due to centrifugal force, but heavier. How on earth is that possible?
The author interprets this surprising result as evidence that the rotating disk was interacting with and restructuring the ether inside it, creating a localized modification of the gravitational field, essentially. A local increase in the ether pressure pushing down. An effect explainable only, in their view, by the wave nature of gravity interacting with the substantive ether medium, influenced by rotation.
Rotation messes with the ether pressure locally.
That's the interpretation offered. They mention pioneers like Birkness and Kozyrev who explored related, unconventional ideas about gravity, rotation, and potential energy sources in space, suggesting this isn't entirely out of left field historically, even if it's outside the mainstream.
So if gravity is a wave-like pressure in this substantive ether, you could potentially shield against it, focus it, maybe even generate anti-gravity by controlling pulsation phases or influence it with rotation. The technological implications are staggering.
That's the powerful implication they draw from this model and the alleged experiment. And they don't stop there. They also scrutinize the gravitational constant, G big G.
The one that's supposed to be the same everywhere in the universe.
Right. They argue it's not truly a universal constant, applicable identically to every interaction between any two bodies. First, they look at its dimensionality. G has units of CVO, G as saw, or volume divided by mass times time squared. They point out that this contains an angular velocity component, radians per second, derived from the time squared in the denominator.
Angular velocity hidden inside G.
This suggests to the author that the inherent pulsation or shivering of bodies is fundamentally embedded within the value of G itself. G isn't just a coupling strength. It reflects the underlying dynamic pulsation that drives the spatial mechanism of attraction and repulsion through the ether.
So G itself carries the signature of this universal pulsation.
That's how they interpret its dimensions. Furthermore, they cite experimental results, claiming that the measured value of G varies significantly depending on the material composition of the interacting bodies. It's said to be proportional to the density or mass of the substance.
G depends on what the objects are made of. It's not constant.
That's the claim. To give an example, finding G for interactions involving gold was supposedly 12 times higher than for interactions involving beryllium.
12 times different. That would completely change gravitational calculations depending on whether you're weighing gold or beryllium. That's revolutionary if true.
It would be. It fundamentally changes the picture of what G represents and how gravity works. So, to sum up this part, gravity is reimagined as a dynamic, pulsating, ether-mediated pressure driven by the inherent pulsation of unique bodies. allowing for both attraction and repulsion, anti-gravitation, and potentially being influenced, screened, or modified by factors like rotation or material composition, with even G itself reflecting these underlying dynamics.
Okay. My understanding of gravity is officially scrambled. If forces in space are so radically different, what about the very fabric of space and time itself? How does Russian mechanics see distance, dimensions, and that ever-elusive concept, time?
Right, if the foundations shift, everything built on them has to be re-examined. Let's start with distance. In standard physics, distance is usually just a static length, a measure of separation between 2 points. How many meters apart are they?
That seems straightforward. A ruler measure.
But in this system, the author challenges that fundamental notion. They argue distance is not a static length, it's a dynamic quantity. Specifically, it's defined as a product of velocity and period. Distance equal vt.
Velocity times period. Wait a minute, v times t, that formula usually gives you wavelength, lambda, like in wave physics.
Exactly, you jumped right to it. And the author explicitly states that this makes distance itself a wave phenomenon. The space between two objects isn't just a fixed empty gap, it's the outcome, the measure of some underlying wave process occurring within the substantive ether.
So the distance across this room isn't just X meters of emptiness, it's fundamentally the result of waves rippling and establishing that separation in the ether, like measuring the crests of a wave.
That's the conceptual leap. Distance itself has a wave nature. And this wave-like nature of spatial separation is presented as central to explaining why space is precisely three-dimensional. No more, no less.
How does that work? Waves dictating dimensions.
The author refers to mathematical arguments presumably related to wave stability or propagation, showing that dynamic wave processes, things like stable planetary orbits or the patterns seen in light spectra, are only mathematically possible and stable in precisely 3 spatial dimensions, not 2, not 4.
So the universe has to be 3D for waves, and therefore distances and orbits, to even work properly.
Therefore, they argue space is fundamentally and only 3-dimensional because that's the only dimensional stage on which these fundamental wave processes can play out. They even mention the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who famously linked the 3-dimensionality of space to the observed inverse square law of gravity and light, another wave-related phenomenon. It's like they're finding deep mathematical and physical reasons rooted in wave dynamics for the 3D world we experience.
It's positing that the very structure of reality, its dimensionality, is tied intrinsically to the mathematics of wave processes in this ether. Okay. But space isn't just 3D and wave-like. You said the ether has structure, right? Cells and density?
Exactly. It's not uniform. Space, as we discussed, is structured by those pulsating ether cells with centers and those neutral zones between levels. And a key feature is that the density of the ether is proposed to increase as you get closer to the center of one of these cells, whether it's the cell defining an atom or a star system.
Like walking towards the dense core of a cosmic honeycomb cell, the ether gets thicker.
Kind of like that, yeah, denser or more structured. And here's the kicker. As this local ether density changes, it alters all the parameters of the space and the parameters of the bodies existing within that space.
Wait, all parameters. So if I move from a lower density ether zone to a higher density one, my own properties, my mass, my size, maybe even how fast my internal pulsation runs will change.
Potentially, yes, numerically speaking, according to the system. Your radius might change, your mass, your pulsation period, but the author adds a crucial caveat, a very important point.
Okay.
These changes, while real within the system, would only be noticeable to an outside observer who isn't in that same space, and therefore isn't also experiencing the identical change in their own properties and their measuring tools.
Ah. So since we and our rulers and our clocks are part of the local space, our properties change right along with the local ether density. Everything scales together.
Exactly. It's like trying to see if your rubber ruler is stretching by measuring it with itself. Is both the object and the ruler stretched proportionally, you won't detect the change from within that frame. So the changes are posited as real, but only relative to an external unaffected reference frame.
Okay. So the changes are real within the physics, but practically undetectable from inside the changing zone. It's a fascinating nuance, very self-consistent in a way. Now, the big one, time. Yeah. If space is a property of the ether, structured and dynamic, what is time in this Russian mechanics view?
This is another huge conceptual shift. The author states emphatically, unequivocally, that time does not exist independently as some kind of universal backdrop or river flowing equally for everyone and everything, separate from the bodies within it. Forget the idea of time existing like the weight of a mass can be considered apart from the mass itself.
Time isn't a universal river, no cosmic clock ticking the same seconds everywhere.
Not in this view. Time, in Russian mechanics, is declared to be a property of a body, just like mass or velocity or pulsation.
Time is a property of an object, like its color or temperature.
Yes, and the specific property of all bodies that carries temporal dimensionality, the property that is time for that body. It's their own pulsation period.
The rate at which a body internally pulsates is its time. That pulsation frequency or period is its internal clock.
That's the radical claim being made. The rhythm of its existence is its time. And since, as we established earlier, every single body in nature is unique and has its own specific set of properties, including its precise pulsation period,
then every single body has its own individual time, its own unique time flow. There's no single universal clock for the cosmos. My clock runs differently from your clock, runs differently from that star's clock.
Exactly. There's no one universal time applicable to all bodies or to the entire universe. Each object ticks to its own internal fundamental rhythm.
Wow, the implications.
They're significant. The author uses this concept to address what they see as a paradox in standard cosmology. The discovery of geological samples on Earth, rocks, whose calculated age, using standard radiometric dating methods, appears older than the estimated age of the universe itself, as determined by cosmological models based on general relativity and the Big Bang.
Right, I've heard about those Methuselah stars and rocks older than the universe. How does body-specific time explain that?
Well, if each rock has its own time, defined by its internal pulsation period, which might have changed over billions of years due to its history and interactions, then its current state might not directly correlate with some universal cosmic start time. Its internal clock might have run faster or slower relative to the assumed universal clock at different epochs. So finding a rock that seems older than the universe might just mean its internal time accumulated differently.
Its internal clock ran differently, so it's not necessarily a paradox, just a consequence of time being local and body-specific. That's a powerful, if incredibly destabilizing idea. It dissolves the notion of a single cosmic history timeline.
It certainly provides a framework for understanding relative age and duration without needing a single absolute cosmic timeline. And they provide a fascinating, more down-to-earth example of how external interactions relate to this body-specific time or pulsation period.
Okay.
They discuss how cyclic temperature changes, like freezing and thawing over seasons or centuries, can cause marble structures, statues, buildings to degrade and crack over time.
Yeah, freeze-thaw cycles are bad for stonework. Physical expansion and contraction, right?
That's the standard explanation. But in the Russian mechanics view, it's deeper than just simple expansion. They argue this happens because the external temperature variations interfere with and disrupt the marble's natural internal pulsation period, its inherent rhythm, its time.
The cold and heat mess with its fundamental vibration.
Yes. This disruption weakens the interconnectedness of the marble's intrinsic properties, causing internal stresses and deformation, shifts in its internal neutral zones, like microcracks perhaps, ultimately leading to structural failure and cracking.
So something like freezing and thawing isn't just a physical expansion-contraction problem on the surface. It's external forces messing with the material's fundamental internal rhythm, its very own time, causing it to essentially degrade itself from within due to that rhythmic disruption.
That's the link they make. It ties external environmental interaction, temperature, internal dynamics, pulsation time, property changes, deformation, and material integrity, cracking, all together under this unified framework based on pulsation. It shows how deeply intertwined these concepts are in Russian mechanics. Time isn't just abstract. It's a physical property susceptible to interaction.
Okay, this is rewriting physics from the ground up. Let's loop back to the basics of motion and force, specifically Newton's laws. Newton's first law, inertia, the cornerstone. A body stays at rest or in uniform motion in a straight line unless acted on by an external force. Seems pretty solid. How does Russian mechanics take issue with this foundational principle?
Oh, they take significant issue with it. The author has a strong critique on several levels. Firstly, they look at the mathematical form often used to express the first law. If the net force F equals 0, then acceleration A equals 0, F man F equals 0.
Right, no force, no acceleration, stay put or keep coasting.
They see this mathematical statement as a pure abstraction that describes motion, or lack thereof, without attributing any intrinsic properties to the body undergoing that motion. It's like trying to describe the properties of nothing or a mathematical point. It lacks physical substance in their view.
A law of motion for something that doesn't intrinsically have properties within the law itself. That seems incomplete if bodies are defined by their properties.
Their view is it misses the essential nature of the body, and they make a very specific, quite technical argument about the A in EFNA when applied to the first law condition. If it is, they claim that in this context, A isn't actually acceleration in the kinematic sense, but it rather represents the gravitational field strength G, which happens to share the same dimensionality, length, time.
Whoa. So, for a body at rest or in uniform motion, the equation FMA should really be interpreted as FMG0 in their system, where G is the local field.
In that specific interpretation within their critique of me abstraction, yes, it's a bit nuanced. But the more fundamental challenge they pose is to the core idea of inertial motion itself, the idea that uniform motion requires no ongoing interaction.
The coasting forever in empty space idea.
Exactly. The author argues that motion, even uniform, inertial motion, cannot occur without continuous interaction. Specifically, interaction with space, which in their system is the substantive structured ether. Motion requires pushing against or interacting with the medium.
Okay, now this directly contradicts Galileo's famous thought experiment, the cornerstone of inertia. Being locked in a windowless cabin of a smoothly sailing ship, Galileo argued you couldn't perform any experiment inside to tell if you were moving uniformly or sitting still at the dock. Physics seems the same inside. He said you don't need interaction for that kind of smooth motion.
The author addresses Galileo's ship argument head-on and claims, well, they claim Galileo is wrong. Flat out.
Galileo was wrong. That's physics heresy.
In the Russian mechanics view, inertial motion is distinguishable from being truly at rest relative to the ether. They argue that instruments inside a uniformly moving body can, in principle, detect its motion because of its ongoing interaction with the surrounding ether.
How? What kind of instrument?
They offer the example of a simple pendulum. Its period or behavior, they claim, would differ slightly inside a room moving inertially through the ether compared to its behavior in a room truly at rest within that ether frame. The interaction with the moving ether would subtly affect it.
So the very foundation of classical mechanics, the principle of inertia, as formulated by Galileo and Newton, based on the idea of motion without ongoing interaction, is seen as fundamentally flawed because it ignores the necessary interaction with the substantive medium of space, the ether.
That's the author's powerful assertion. They believe this omission, this assumption of motion in a void without interaction, sent physics down a mistaken path regarding the true nature of motion, space, and interaction.
Mind blown again. Okay, if simply moving uniformly requires continuous interaction with the ether, what happens when a body accelerates? When its velocity changes?
Well, acceleration means the interaction with the ether intensifies. It's changing its state of motion relative to the medium more drastically. And this increased interaction, according to the system, causes the body's intrinsic properties to change numerically.
Acceleration physically changes the body itself. How? Which properties?
The text states its radius, its mass, its weight, and even the strength of its own gravitational field can all change quantitatively when it accelerates. It's not just its velocity vector changing. The body itself transforms slightly due to the intensified ether interaction.
Acceleration changes your mass. And your size. That's not something we usually consider. Does it get heavier or lighter, bigger or smaller?
The implication seems to be, based on later examples, that acceleration typically leads to an increase in mass and weight and a decrease in size due to increased compression or interaction with the ether. And this brings us to another concept that gets redefined, weight.
Okay, what's weight in this system? It's not just mass times local g.
It's related, but the mechanism is different. Weight isn't just the abstract force of gravity pulling down from afar. It's described more concretely as the pressure exerted by the Earth's gravipole, their term for its gravitational field, ether, pressure zone in this context, compressing the body, pushing it against whatever supports it, and causing a measurable physical deformation.
So my weight is less about a distant attraction and more about the local ether pressure literally squeezing me into the Earth and how much I deform or resist that squeeze.
It's a pressure-induced deformation, essentially. Weight is the measure of that compression. And from the body's perspective, its own weight acts like an external force causing its deformation.
My weight is an external force squeezing me. Okay, that's a different perspective. And this redefined concept of weight as pressure and deformation leads to a direct challenge to another classical idea, right? Weightlessness in orbit.
Yes, exactly. Particularly the idea of achieving weightlessness. At first cosmic velocity, the speed needed to achieve a stable orbit around, say, the Earth. Classical physics says you become weightless when orbiting because you're constantly falling.
Yeah, floating astronauts, 0G, that's the standard image in teaching.
But the author calculates, based on their framework of acceleration interacting with the ether and changing body properties, that as a body accelerates to first cosmic velocity, its weight doesn't decrease to zero. It actually increases significantly.
Weight increases in orbit. How?
Because the total force squeezing the body gets stronger. You have the baseline pressure from the Earth's gravipole, plus the additional interaction force generated by accelerating rapidly through the ether. The sum of these pressures is greater.
So orbiting makes you heavier, not lighter? Do they give numbers?
They do. They calculate that for a sphere accelerated to first cosmic velocity, around 7.9 kilometers near Earth, its radius would shrink significantly by nearly a quarter. Its mass would increase by almost 20%, its weight would effectively double, and its own local gravitational field nearby would increase substantially by almost 75%.
Mass increases 20%. Weight doubles at orbital speed. That's the absolute opposite of weightlessness. What on earth are astronauts feeling then? Why do they float?
This is where the interpretation comes in. In this system, the apparent weightlessness experienced in orbit isn't the absence of weight. It's argued to be an inability to detect the body's increased weight using standard measurement methods inside the accelerating system, the spacecraft.
Why can't they measure it?
Because the weighing mechanism, the astronaut's body, the spacecraft itself, everything inside is part of the same accelerating environment, experiencing the same kind of intensified interaction with the ether and undergoing similar property changes. There's no unaffected internal reference point against which to compare the increased weight. Everything is falling or accelerating together within that modified ether environment.
Wow. Okay, so let me try to recap this madness. Inertial motion isn't free. It requires interaction with the ether. Acceleration physically changes a body's intrinsic properties, like mass and size. Weight is the feeling of being compressed by ether pressure, causing deformation. And the weightlessness we see in orbit is actually an illusion caused by your weight increasing significantly, but being undetectable from within the accelerating frame.
That's a very good summary of this radical rethinking of basic mechanics. It requires a complete overhaul of how we view force, motion, mass, weight, and even the act of measurement in different frames of reference.
My classical physics brain is officially aching. Given how drastically Russian mechanics redefines these classical concepts, it sounds like it's inevitably going to have a major conflict with quantum mechanics as well, the physics of the very small.
You are absolutely correct. The clash is perhaps even more direct and fundamental here. The author is quite blunt about it, stating explicitly that the fundamental postulates of quantum mechanics are incorrect and do not accurately describe the motion and nature of elementary particles within atoms.
Just incorrect. Not incomplete, but wrong. That's a huge statement against one of the pillars of modern science. What are the specific issues the author has with QM's picture of the atom and its constituents?
There are several major points of conflict outlined in the material. First, quantum mechanics often treats the electron, for example, not as a distinct physical body with defined properties like radius, mass, internal structure, and its own intrinsic pulsation, but rather as a point charge, or more commonly as a probability cloud or wave function, a mathematical description of where it might be found.
Right, the electron's smeared out in an orbital.
This fuzzy probabilistic view clashes fundamentally with the Russian mechanics' insistence that all fundamental units are unique, property-laden, definite bodies, even if they are pulsating and interacting dynamically. QM sees a statistical possibility or a fuzzy entity, while RM sees a concrete, if complex and dynamic object.
Okay, so clash number one. Fuzzy probability versus definite pulsating body. What's next?
Second, QM postulates largely empty space within the atom, between the nucleus and the regions where electrons are most likely found, the orbitals. Just vast emptiness dotted with these probabilities.
Yeah, the atom is mostly empty space. That's what they teach.
This is in complete direct opposition to the Russian mechanics model of a substantive cellular ether forming space everywhere, including densely structured inside atoms. There is no true void in their model.
Empty void versus structured substantive ether filling the atom. That's a fundamental incompatibility right there. Two completely different pictures of atomic real estate.
Third, the author views concepts like specific quantized electron orbits, as pictured in the older simplified Bohr model, and the more abstract, mathematically defined orbitals of modern QM as artificial mathematical constructs. They see them as convenient fictions that help with calculations, but don't represent the true physical reality of particle motion within the atom's ether structure.
So Bohr orbits and QM orbitals are just Useful math tricks, not real paths or places.
That's the strong implication. They even claim that the standard QM equations developed for the first, simplest electron orbit in hydrogen don't work correctly for subsequent higher energy orbits without adding extra assumptions or corrections, suggesting the model isn't as robust or fundamental as claimed.
Artificial orbits and fuzzy probability clouds just don't cut it in this view.
Mm.
Okay, what about the really weird stuff in QM, the stuff that makes headlines? Like the double slit experiment where a single electron seems to go through two slits at once and interfere with itself, or wave-particle duality. How does RM handle that apparent weirdness?
The author argues that the standard, often paradoxical interpretations of experiments like the double slit, which lead to counterintuitive ideas like an electron being in two places at once or being both a wave and a particle simultaneously, wave-particle duality, are ultimately consequences of using the wrong physical model to begin with.
Wrong model how?
Specifically, they result from denying the fundamental pulsation of all bodies, including electrons, and denying the substantive structured nature of space, the ether. In their view, if you accept that the electron is a pulsating body with wave properties and that it's traveling through a substantive ether that also has wave-like properties and structure, you don't need these seemingly paradoxical interpretations involving particles being in multiple places at once.
So the weirdness of QM isn't a fundamental feature of reality, but a kind of bug or artifact that arises because the standard model ignores the physical reality of pulsation and the ether medium. We get paradoxes because we're missing key ingredients.
That's precisely the argument presented. They believe that if you incorporate pulsation and substantive ether into the picture, the behavior of electrons in atoms and in experiments like the double slit can potentially be explained using modified macro-world laws, essentially, the principles of Russian mechanics applied consistently at the atomic scale.
How would that work? How does an electron move in this model?
An electron, being a pulsating body, moves on some kind of orbit or trajectory within the atom's ether structure due to complex interactions with surrounding ether, which is also affected by the nucleus's pulsation. It's constantly exchanging energy with the ether as it moves and pulsates. Its path is determined by these dynamic interactions, not by abstract probability rules.
So an atom is really just a miniature solar system governed by the same kind of dynamic mechanics, just scaled down with different parameters.
More or less, yes. That analogy is central. To illustrate their point about the double slit experiment needing a more complete physical picture, the author proposes a kind of absurdly scaled up macro model thought experiment.
A macro double slit.
Yeah, imagine the barrier with the slits is tens of Earth radii thick. The slits themselves are as far apart as the Earth and Moon. The electron gun shooting the particles is as far away as the Earth from the Sun. And the bullets, macroelectrons, are fired faster than Earth's escape velocity.
Okay, that's ridiculously huge. What's the point?
The point is, if you're actually trying to set up and analyze such a macro experiment, you would absolutely have to account for the material properties of that incredibly thick barrier. The nature of the medium the bullets are traveling through over that vast distance, is it truly empty, and the interactions along the way. Standard QM, in the author's view, effectively ignores these crucial physical factors, the reality of the barrier material, the nature of space, when discussing elementary particles passing through thin slits, leading to interpretations that seem mystical or paradoxical because the physical context is stripped away.
It sounds like they're saying QM's weirdness isn't a feature of reality, but a bug in the standard model's oversimplified setup that ignores the material structure of space and the particles themselves. Treat it like a real physical system, and the weirdness might resolve into complex interactions.
That appears to be the core message. Quantum phenomena aren't magic. They're just complex mechanical interactions happening within a substantive ether, requiring a more complete physical model, their Russian mechanics model, to be properly understood.
This brings us neatly to the specific model of the atom proposed by Russian mechanics, which leans heavily into that very idea of atoms being like miniature solar systems, something Ernest Rutherford initially suggested based on his scattering experiments.
Yes, the author explicitly embraces Rutherford's early intuition, seeing it as fundamentally correct, the as above so below principle in action. The basic structure repeats across scales, from solar systems down to atoms.
So how does Russian mechanics actually model, say, the hydrogen atom as a tiny solar system? What does that look like in detail?
Well, the author performs a fascinating thought experiment, scaling the hydrogen atom up to the size of our solar system to compare the structures. And they immediately highlight what they see as a fundamental absurdity in the standard Bohr model. and even the QM orbital picture when you try to visualize it physically.
An absurdity in the standard model, what is it?
In the standard model, particularly the Bohr model for simplicity, the first electron orbit, the lowest energy level, is calculated to be a certain distance from the nucleus. This radius is often conceptually treated as the effective boundary of the atom.
Okay, the edge of the atom, more or less.
But then, subsequent electron orbits, or the regions of highest probability for orbitals, are calculated to exist outside this first orbit, further away from the nucleus, sometimes significantly so. The author finds this nonsensical from a physical standpoint. How can the electron orbits exist outside the atom's own supposed boundary? They describe it somewhat scornfully as electrons being lined up in orbitals beyond the atom's defined limits.
Wait, electrons orbiting outside the atom they belong to? That just seems illogical. Electrons are supposed to be inside the atom, right? That's the whole point.
It does seem counterintuitive. The author attributes this apparent absurdity to a historical mathematical choice. How the Bohr orbits were initially normalized in the standard model, assigning the first innermost possible orbit the principal quantum number n1 in a sequence, n1, 2, 3. They argue this seemingly innocent mathematical normalization choice effectively knocked quantum mechanics outside the consistent realms of classical electrodynamics and mechanics, leading to this physically strange picture.
So, a mathematical convention, how they started counting the orbits, made the resulting physical picture look nonsensical.
That's the claim. To fix this perceived absurdity, in the Russian mechanics model, electron orbits and the electrons themselves must reside inside the atom's physically defined boundaries, just like planets orbit the sun well within the overall boundary of the solar system, like the Oort cloud, perhaps.
Okay, that makes more physical sense. Electrons belong inside. So how do electrons arrange themselves inside the atom in this system? If not Bohr orbits or QM orbitals, what defines their possible locations or paths?
This is where the pulsation and the substantive ether come back into play, but now operating inside the atom's boundary. The model proposes that the nucleus's own pulsation excites waves in the surrounding substantive ether within the atom.
Waves in the atom's internal ether generated by the nucleus vibrating.
Yes, and these waves, propagating outwards from the nucleus, interact with the electron's own pulsation. This interaction creates standing waves within the atom's ether.
Standing waves inside the atom, like the patterns on a vibrating guitar string, but in 3 dimensions, filling the space inside the atom.
Essentially, yes, that's a good analogy. Think of complex 3D resonance patterns. And these standing waves, like all waves, have nodes, points or surfaces of zero wave displacement, and antinodes, points or surfaces of maximum wave displacement.
Okay, nodes and antinodes within the atom's ether, what do they do?
According to the author, these standing waves, established by the nucleus-ether interaction, quantize space within the atom. They naturally define specific zones or shells where electrons can reside stably. And where do they reside? At the antinodes, the regions of maximum wave energy or displacement.
So the standing waves create these natural resonant locations, the antinodes, and those are the only places electrons can stably exist or orbit. The waves themselves create the allowed orbits.
That's the picture. The standing waves are like naturally occurring quantized pathways or shells defined by the ether's resonance. The distance between the nodes of these standing waves defines a characteristic transverse wavelength for the structure within the atom.
So quantization isn't imposed by weird rules, but emerges naturally from wave mechanics in the ether. And how many orbits does this allow?
By calculating the possible standing wavelengths outwards from the nucleus surface within the atom's boundary, the author finds potentially many possible stable orbits or electron trajectories defined by these antinodes. They calculate up to 65 orbital trajectories in their hydrogen atom solar system analogy.
65 possible stable orbits for hydrogen, not just the handful implied by the principal quantum numbers. That dramatically changes the complexity and richness of atomic structure.
It increases the number of possible stable configurations significantly. And remember, the electrons occupying these orbits are still unique bodies, as discussed earlier. Each electron, residing on its specific orbit defined by a particular standing wave antinode, has unique parameters: mass, charge, field properties, pulsation phase, etc. These parameters differ slightly from electrons on other orbits or even electrons in other atoms, reflecting their unique relationship with the local ether density and field structure at that specific antinode location.
Each electron tailored to its specific spot in the atomic standing wave pattern.
That seems to be the idea. And they note these individual electrons are difficult to observe directly or distinguish, partly because our measuring instruments are themselves made of atoms interacting with the same complex ether fields.
Okay, this model paints a very different picture. A dynamic, resonant cavity filled with standing ether waves with unique electrons residing at the antinodes. How does this model explain atomic radiation, the emission of specific frequencies of light, photons, when electrons change energy levels or jump orbits? That's a cornerstone of QM and spectroscopy.
Right, that's a crucial test for any atomic model. In this system, when an electron moves between these stable orbits from one standing wave antinode to another, the emission of a photon is linked to two things. First, the changes in the electron's own intrinsic properties as it moves to a region with different ether characteristics, and second, its interaction with the variable density of the ether inside the atom.
Variable ether density inside the atom? I thought it just got denser towards the middle.
Apparently, it's more complex. The author suggests the density of the ether doesn't change smoothly as you move outwards from the nucleus. It changes non-monotonically, perhaps in jumps or steps, related to the underlying cellular structure of the ether, even at that scale.
So the ether density profile inside the atom isn't smooth, but bumpy.
That seems to be the implication. These jumps or variations in ether density influence the electron's motion parameters, like its pulsation frequency or energy state. When an electron transitions between orbits located in regions of different ether density, this interaction, this adjustment to the new environment, results in the emission of a photon, whose characteristics, energy, frequency, are determined by the property changes and the ether density difference.
So an electron jumps because the very nature of the space it's moving into changes abruptly due to the ether structure, and that interaction shakes loose a photon reflecting that change. It's a physical interaction with the medium, not just an abstract energy level transition.
That's the proposed physical mechanism for spectral emission. And related to spectra, the author also presents a fascinating and quite controversial challenge to the standard interpretation of atomic spectral series. The named series like Lyman, Balmer, Paschen for hydrogen, as definitive fingerprints unique to that element.
They challenge that, but those spectral lines are how we identify elements across the universe.
They do challenge the uniqueness interpretation. They note that if you look at the wavelengths within these famous series from hydrogen, they don't just appear randomly. The ratios between consecutive lines or lines in different series often follow a remarkably consistent mathematical pattern. Specifically, they differ by a constant coefficient, approximately 1.0594.
1.0594. Does that number mean anything?
Yes. The author points out this is precisely the 12th root of 2, which is the fundamental ratio between adjacent notes in the Western tempered musical scale, like the jump from C to C sharp.
Wait, the hydrogen spectrum fits a musical scale. The spacing of its light emissions follows musical ratios.
Yes, precisely that ratio, according to the author's analysis presented in the source. They argue this cannot be a coincidence. It implies that the spectral lines might be a manifestation of an underlying mathematical pattern based on fundamental ratios, perhaps related to the structure of the standing waves in the ether, which might naturally follow these kinds of harmonic relationships rather than being a property uniquely and exclusively tied to the hydrogen atom itself, wherever it's found.
So the hydrogen signature might actually be a signature of a universal harmonic structure in the ether, which hydrogen atoms just happen to excite effectively.
That's the radical suggestion. Maybe other elements excite different parts of the same underlying harmonic structure. They reinforce this by pointing out that even the standard QM model, despite its successes, still struggles to accurately calculate all the spectral lines perfectly, even for simple hydrogen, without various adjustments, corrections, and approximations like fine structure, hyperfine structure, or spectral line shift. If the model based on the spectrum can't perfectly predict the spectrum it's based on, maybe, the author suggests, there's a deeper, simpler pattern related to these fundamental ratios being missed.
If the standard model struggles with the details, maybe this author is right, that there's a deeper, perhaps musical pattern at play, rooted in the ether's resonance structure. This whole atom model, a resonant cavity, standing ether waves, unique electrons at the antinodes, spectra reflecting ether density jumps, maybe musical ratios was much more, I don't know, substantial and interconnected, like a miniature, vibrating musical universe.
It certainly aims to provide a more physically intuitive and internal consistent model that aligns with their core principles of pulsation and ether structure, extending those ideas right down into the heart of matter to explain quantum phenomena mechanistically.
Okay, let's keep pushing the boundaries.
No.
What are some of the more unusual or unexpected concepts that emerge from this comprehensive Russian mechanics system beyond the atoms and basic forces? You mentioned something earlier that sounded intriguing, Gravilides.
Yes, that's a fascinating concept introduced in the texts. The author proposes the existence of gravilides in the macro world, the realm of planets and stars, as being analogous to photons, which are quanta of action, packets of energy momentum, in the microworld of atoms.
Gravilides, analogous to photons. So
Yeah.
packets of gravitational energy or interaction, like little gravity grenades being thrown between planets.
That's the conceptual picture, yes. Quanta of gravitational action. And the claim is that celestial bodies, like planets, can emit these gravilides.
Planets shooting out packets of gravity. What happens when they do?
According to the author, the emission of a gravilide by a planet can cause it to change its orbit, specifically moving it to an orbit closer to the central star, like the sun. This is presented as directly analogous to how an electron in an atom moves to a lower energy orbit by emitting a photon.
So planets jump orbits by spitting out gravilides. That would certainly explain orbital changes we sometimes struggle to account for, and they take it further.
Yes, the author even speculates that major universal or planetary catastrophes, perhaps sudden shifts in orbits, collisions, or unexplained energy releases, might be linked to powerful sudden emissions of these gravilides from celestial bodies.
So shifts in planetary positions, or maybe even cosmic disasters, could be caused by planets shedding these fundamental units of gravitational interaction. That's a wild idea, extending quantum-like discrete energy transitions right up to the orbits of entire worlds.
It's a bold attempt to find universal principles and quanta of action that are applicable at both the micro and macro scales, unifying dynamics across the vast hierarchy of the cosmos using similar mechanisms.
Very ambitious. Okay, what about other fundamental fields, like magnetism? We talked about gravity and hinted at electricity. How does magnetism fit into this unified picture, especially in the atom-solar system analogy?
Right. In that analogy where the atom mirrors the solar system, the source material emphasizes electrical and gravitational fields as the primary interactions governing the structure. Magnetism is viewed somewhat differently.
How so? Not fundamental in the same way.
It's often described either as an analog of the gravitational field, but operating at the macro level, a similar type of field phenomenon, but manifesting differently due to the scale or ether properties, or perhaps more commonly in the text, as a consequence of deformation or rotation within the ether body system.
An analog of gravity, or a side effect of deformation or spinning. That's different from the standard view of electromagnetism being unified.
Yes, and the author offers a very different explanation for how magnetism arises, particularly in materials like electrical conductors. They argue strongly that the magnetic field isn't primarily generated by the electron as it moves through the conductor, which is the standard picture. Moving charge creates magnetic field.
If the electron's motion isn't the main source, what is?
Instead, they propose that when an external magnetic field is applied to a conductor, or when a current starts, it physically deforms the atoms and nuclei within the conductor material itself. This deformation changes the pulsation state of these atoms and nuclei. It's this collective, altered pulsation of the conductor's own lattice structure, induced by the external influence, that creates the conductor's magnetic field.
So it's the structure of the conductor itself, its vibrating atoms responding to the external field or the initiation of current, that generates the internal magnetism, not the electrons flowing through it directly. The material itself becomes magnetic due to deformation and pulsation changes.
That's the argument presented. The magnetic influence is described as propagating through the conductor almost like a magnetic pressure wave, linked to these atomic deformations, traveling at or near the speed of light.
A magnetic pressure wave. And what about the electrons, then? What are they doing if they're not making the field?
They further suggest that in a conductor carrying current, it's not actually the electrons that perform most of the work or energy transfer. It's the atoms and nuclei of the lattice, interacting via this magnetic pressure wave and their changing pulsations. Electron movement is seen more as a secondary effect, a consequence.
A side effect. So the electron drift we learn about is just incidental.
Perhaps not entirely incidental, but not the prime mover. The text suggests electron movement might happen, perhaps spirally above the conductor surface, synchronized with the propagation of this magnetic pressure wave through the material, rather than simply flowing linearly and uniformly through the bulk material proportional to speed, as the standard classical Drude model describes. This completely upends the textbook picture of electron flow in a wire.
Whoa. So the electrons are just kind of surfing on the magnetic wave generated by the vibrating, deforming atoms of the wire itself. That's a much more complex, dynamic, and frankly bizarre picture of electrical current.
It is indeed. It emphasizes the role of the medium, the conductor lattice, and its ether, over the individual particles. They even use this framework to re-explain Arago's classic experiment.
Arago's experiment. Remind me.
That's where a magnetic needle suspended near a rotating non-magnetic conducting disk, like copper, is dragged along or damped. Standard physics explains this by Foucault currents, eddy currents, induced in the disk by the moving magnet, creating an opposing magnetic field.
Right, induced currents.
But the author here offers a different explanation. They argue it's not primarily Foucault currents, but rather the gravitational deformation of the conductor's molecules caused by the combined gravitational fields of both the Earth and the nearby magnet. This deformation, they claim, interacts with the magnetic field energy and converts it into heat within the disk, causing the damping effect on the needle.
Gravitational deformation caused by Earth and a magnet interacting with magnetic energy to create heat and damp the needle. That links gravity, magnetism, and thermal energy all through material deformation at the molecular level. That's quite an intricate connection.
It's all part of the broader drive in this system towards unifying what standard physics treats as separate forces and phenomena. The author explicitly proposes that electrical and gravitational interactions are fundamentally the same type of phenomenon, perhaps interaction via pulsation and ether pressure, but just occurring in different density spaces, meaning those different cellular levels of the ether hierarchy, atomic versus macroscopic.
Same interaction, different ether environment gives different results, electric versus gravitational.
That's the idea. And similarly, magnetic and gravitational forces are also suggested to be manifestations of the same underlying phenomenon, perhaps both caused by the deformation of space, the ether, or the deformation of the bodies within it.
So it's all ultimately boiling down to different flavors or manifestations of the same core interactions. Pulsation, ether dynamics, ether pressure, deformation, just playing out differently depending on the scale and the local conditions within this structured hierarchical universe. A grand unification based on mechanics and medium properties.
That's the ultimate goal presented in the source material. A unified field picture based on these fundamental mechanical concepts operating within a substantive ether.
Okay. This is incredibly elaborate. But if you're going to propose such a radically different physics, you probably need a radically different mathematical language to describe it, right? The author suggests standard mathematics like calculus and vector algebra isn't quite up to the task.
Correct. That's a crucial point the author makes. They argue that the conventional mathematical tools, while powerful for the fragmented view of classical and quantum physics, are insufficient or perhaps even inappropriate for fully describing this proposed unified physics based on intrinsic interconnected properties, dynamic pulsation, and a structured, non-uniform ether. They need a different foundation, one that reflects the inherent relationships and structure they see in nature.
And this different foundation involves the golden ratio. Fine. That seems to pop up everywhere in nature, but using it as the basis for physics math.
Yes, extensively. The golden ratio, via 1.618, and its inverse, LVR 0.618, which is area 1, are absolutely central to their proposed mathematical framework. They start by discussing the well-known appearance of these numbers in sequences like the Fibonacci sequence, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8,
right,
and the Lucas sequence, 1, 3, 4, 7, 11, where the ratio of consecutive terms rapidly approaches EA.
Right, the rabbit breeding seashell spiral connection, that's familiar territory.
It is, but the author makes a significant and perhaps controversial claim beyond that. They state that any pair of real numbers, not just the standard starting pairs like 101 or 13, when subjected to this same sequential summing process, add the last two to get the next, will eventually converge to the ratio of phi between consecutive terms.
Any starting pair. So if I start with like pi and e and keep adding them up, the ratio will eventually become the golden ratio. That's a wild claim about fundamental number behavior. Is that even proven?
The source presents it as a key property, suggesting a deeper inherent structure to number relationships when viewed dynamically through this additive process. They argue the numbers somehow remember their place in the sequence, a unique property they feel isn't fully accounted for or utilized in standard number theory. It points towards an inherent convergence property linked to the concept of golden harmony.
Numbers remembering their place, converging to phi. Okay. And they connect this ratio to geometry too, right? Something about dividing a line.
Yes, they focus on the specific geometric construction known as dividing a line segment in extreme and mean ratio, which is the classical definition of the golden ratio. They show how applying the Pythagorean theorem within geometric constructions related to this division method naturally reveals irrational numbers related to A. They argue this process effectively quantizes the geometric relationships based on A. This specific division method yields 3 segments. Let's call them A, B, C, where A is the largest, C is the smallest, and A equals B plus C, such that the ratio of the whole to the larger part is the same as the ratio of the larger part to the smaller part. AB equals BC equals A.
So the golden ratio is deeply embedded in the very structure of geometry and number theory in a way that traditional mathematics might overlook or not fully leverage. It's not just a curious number, but a fundamental structuring principle.
In this view, yes, absolutely fundamental. And this specific division method and the relationships it reveals is used to generate a unique infinite sequence of interconnected proportional numbers that the author calls the infinite irrational Russian row.
The Russian row, what does it look like?
It's a sequence centered around 1.00, extending infinitely in both directions, with terms related by powers or functions of its diagonals. Examples given include numbers like 0.382, which is 0.486, 0.618, 0.786, 0.001, 0.6186, 1.6186058, 2.618, 3.330, and so on, both inwards towards zero and outwards towards infinity. All terms are interconnected through golden ratio relationships.
An infinite sequence of these special golden numbers forming the Russian row, and this row is the basis for.
This row is the fundamental building block for their core mathematical structure, the IQA, the Russian matrix.
A matrix again. Okay, what is this Russian matrix? Is it like a spreadsheet filled with these Russian row numbers?
It's presented as much more profound and structured than a simple spreadsheet. It's described as an infinite, volumetric, potentially 3D or even higher dimensional matrix. Imagine a grid extending infinitely. It's centered on a basal number 1. And the numbers from the Russian row are arranged within it, not just linearly, but in a specific interconnected pattern, often described as having a double-cross arrangement of numbers, horizontal, vertical, and diagonal rows, all passing through and related to the central one.
So picture an infinite grid, maybe even a 3D lattice, extending in all directions, filled specifically with these irrational golden numbers from the Russian row, all intrinsically interconnected and reflecting symmetries around the central number 1.
Yes, that's the concept. And crucially, unlike standard coordinate systems like Cartesian XYZ that can use any arbitrary real number for coordinates, this matrix is presented as a naturally quantized system. It's built only from these inherent related irrational numbers derived from the golden ratio.
Naturally quantized, so the math itself has discrete structure built in.
That's the idea. All numbers in the matrix are individual, irrational, interconnected, and each number supposedly has an inverse analog symmetrically placed across the central basal 1. It forms a self-contained, structured mathematical universe.
A naturally quantized, self-similar, symmetrical mathematical structure based on fundamental ratios. And this is supposed to be the language of their physics.
Exactly. They argue this matrix is the natural mathematical language for describing their dynamic, qualitative, interconnected physics. They contrast it sharply with the static, measurement-based equations often used in classical physics, giving the example of Minkowski's famous 4D spacetime interval equation. S squares equals c squared t squared minus x squared minus y squared minus z squared.
Right, the foundation of special relativity's spacetime geometry. What's their issue with it?
They critique it on several grounds from their perspective. They point out that it mixes quantities with different physical units, time squared, length squared, and relies on arbitrary coordinate numbers, x, y, z, t, that aren't inherently linked. In contrast, their proposed equations, derived from relationships within the Russian matrix, are based only on the intrinsic relationships between consecutive irrational numbers from the Russian row. This, they claim, results in dimensionless relationships, reflecting pure proportionality.
So their math is built purely on the inherent structure and ratios of these special numbers within the matrix, not on trying to algebraically connect different types of measured quantities like length and time. It's about the ratios, not the units.
That seems to be the fundamental distinction they're making. It's a math based on inherent qualitative relationships represented by these specific irrational numbers, rather than quantitative measurements plugged into formulas. They emphasize that the Russian matrix, based on these golden ratio progressions, using both h1.618 and another related constant h.786, forms a formal mathematical whole with unique properties. These properties include complex recurrence relationships and even fractal-like summation properties.
Fractal-like summations, like what?
They give examples where summing specific, non-adjacent elements from different parts of the matrix results in exactly zero, demonstrating deep, non-local internal connections and symmetries within the structure. For instance, an element at position, 966 added a 1 at metatal 1, 3, might equal 0. This is definitely not standard matrix arithmetic. It points to hidden patterns and conservation laws embedded in the matrix structure itself.
Sums of numbers far apart canceling out perfectly. That definitely suggests a highly ordered and interconnected mathematical universe underlying their physics.
It does. And these mathematical structures, the Russian row and the Russian matrix, are then used to derive what the author calls the quantitative significance of physical properties.
Quantitative significance, what does that mean?
These are specific, fixed numerical values that are proposed to be inherently associated with fundamental physical properties like time, force, gravity, energy, mass, etc. These numerical values aren't arbitrary units like seconds or kilograms. They are derived directly from the mathematical relationships within the Russian matrix system, often involving the golden ratio and potentially related constants or simple integer powers, like powers of 2, based on a table provided in some source versions.
So properties like mass or time don't just have arbitrary units we assign. They have specific inherent numerical values within the system, linked fundamentally to the golden ratio and the structure of the special matrix. Like mass has an intrinsic fineness value.
Something like that, yes. A fundamental numerical essence derived from the matrix. And these quantitative significances, derived from the Russian matrix structure, are presented as the key to their grand unification of physics.
How do these numbers unify physics?
The author claims they allow the creation of invariants. These are dimensionless products formed by multiplying the quantitative significances of various physical properties together, perhaps raised to certain powers. And the key claim is that these specific combinations, dictated by the matrix structure, are always equal to 1.
Dimensionless products of these fundamental property numbers always equal exactly 1. What does that mean physically, like mass significance, like speed significance, energy significance, etc.?
Perhaps something along those lines, yes. These invariants, according to the author, represent the fundamental qualitative interconnected relationships between physical properties. They embody the laws of nature in a dimensionless, purely relational form. And because they are dimensionless and always equal to 1, they can bridge descriptions across different domains of physics, mechanics, electrodynamics, thermodynamics, etc., all tied back to that central basal 1 in the Russian matrix. It's a different kind of unification than searching for one master equation that covers all forces.
So the universe's laws are unified not by one complex formula governing forces, but by a set of fundamental dimensionless relationships between the inherent golden ratio-based numerical values of its properties, all derived from the structure of this special Russian matrix. That's essentially a mathematical theory of everything, built on ratio and structure, not force equations.
It is indeed a radical and alternative vision for both the structure of physical law and the kind of mathematics needed to describe it. It attempts to tie physical reality directly and intrinsically to inherent mathematical ratios and structures, centered around the golden ratio.
Okay. Mind thoroughly blown, mathematical foundations rebuilt. So bringing this entire vast system together, how does this complete framework, the pulsating unique bodies, the substantive cellular ether, the gravity as pressure with anti-gravity, the body-specific time, all described by golden ratio math in the Russian matrix, how does this propose a truly unified picture of nature, their version of a theory of everything?
Based on the source material, the system proposes that the fundamental structure and the laws of nature are essentially uniform across all scales, that as above, so below principle we keep returning to. This uniformity arises because all bodies and systems are organized into those different nested levels within the hierarchical ether structure. The universe level, the galaxy level, the star system level, the atom level, and potentially infinitely inwards and outward.
Nested structures, okay.
And the key is that the form of the interactions is proposed to be the same at each of these respective levels, governed by the same underlying principles: pulsation, ether pressure, deformation, described by the matrix math. However, these interactions manifest differently. We give them different names like gravity or electric force, depending on the specific properties, particularly the density and structure of the ether at that particular scale.
So gravity works fundamentally like electromagnetism in the sense that it's a dynamic interaction with the medium involving pulsation and pressure. But the specific parameters involved, like the strength or the G equivalent and the resulting phenomena, look different because the ether environment at the stellar scale is vastly different from the ether environment inside an atom.
Yeah, exactly. Same underlying mechanics, different stage, different props. And the author explicitly contrasts this approach with the current mainstream scientific search for a single theory of everything, TOE. The mainstream search typically tries to find a quantum field theory framework that can unite the four fundamental interactions: gravity, electromagnetism, weak nuclear, strong nuclear, as they are currently understood within the standard model.
Right, trying to quantize gravity and merge it with the others.
The author of Russian Mechanics implies that this mainstream search might be misguided because it's starting from what they see as flawed premises, fragmented forces, empty space, etc. They suggested their own framework based on these radically different concepts: pulsation, substantive ether, inherent properties, unique bodies. Golden ratio mathematics already provides such a unified picture. It's a unification based on mechanics and medium, not just force fields.
Wow, so they're not searching for a theory of everything. They're essentially saying, we think we found one, and it requires you to abandon most of your current assumptions about space, time, matter, force, and even the right way to use math in physics. That's incredibly bold.
That's the powerful conclusion the text strongly suggests. The source material we reviewed ends by reflecting on the profound, almost philosophical implications of adopting this perspective. The author suggests that the more one examines the world through the lens of Russian mechanics, the more mysterious, intricate, and beautiful it actually becomes.
More beautiful through this lens. How so?
They propose a fascinating paradox, that the remarkable uniformity and order we observe in nature arises precisely from the fundamental uniqueness of its individual components. The system works harmoniously because every part is distinct and interacts in its specific way within the structured whole.
Order emerges from uniqueness. Not from identical building blocks, but from a perfectly orchestrated interplay of individuals. That's another delightful twist in this system. It feels less like a machine and more like an orchestra.
That's a great analogy. And this view, the author argues, moves physics beyond simply seeing nature as a cold, impersonal mechanism, like a giant clockwork. It moves towards what the Russian text describes as a more animated or understanding.
Odukotvornaya? What does that translate to, roughly?
It's hard to translate perfectly, but it implies something like ensouled, inspired, spiritualized, or perhaps simply intrinsically dynamic and alive. The idea is that nature, in this view, isn't just inert matter following external laws. It possesses an inherent vibrancy, interconnectedness, and perhaps even a form of rudimentary consciousness or responsiveness at every level due to the constant pulsation and interaction. It's not just clockwork. There's an inherent life to the mechanism.
A universe that's not built on static, separate forces operating in an empty void, but on dynamic, pulsating, unique, interconnected bodies embedded within a structured, substantive, living medium, all governed by elegant, inherent mathematical ratios derived from the golden mean. It paints a picture of a cosmos that is both deeply ordered and infinitely, profoundly alive.
It certainly offers a profound and very, very different way to perceive the reality we inhabit. A fundamentally mechanical, yet simultaneously animated view of everything.
Wow, okay. We have truly traveled through a stunningly, as the author promised, unrecognizable physical world today, based entirely on this source material you, our listener, provided. Thank you again for sending this our way.
It's been quite the journey. We started by challenging the fundamental definition of a body itself, moving away from just mass to a collection of interconnected, intrinsic, potentially anisotropic properties.
Right. And then we explored that core concept of intrinsic pulsation as a universal driving force behind everything, giving all bodies wave properties and defining their very existence through constant energetic work.
And we welcome back the seemingly archaic idea of a substantive, structured cellular ether, not as a passive backdrop, but as the very fabric forming space itself, organized in nested hierarchies from the infinitesimal to the infinite.
Then things got really wild. We saw gravity reimagined not as a pull, but as an ether pressure pushing towards a pressure that's pulsating and depends on the phase relationship between bodies, allowing for both attraction and repulsion. Hello, anti-gravitation.
And the stunning claim that this ether pressure gravity can potentially be influenced, shielded, or screened, supported by alleged experimental evidence involving rotation-changing weight, plus the idea that big G isn't constant, but depends on material and contains the signature of pulsation.
My head still spins on that one. And we wrestled with the idea that time might not be a universal river, but a unique intrinsic property of each body, fundamentally tied to its own pulsation period, dissolving the notion of a single cosmic clock.
We dissected the classical law of inertia, finding it wanting in this framework, explored the startling idea that acceleration quantitatively changes a body's fundamental properties, like mass and radius, due to ether interaction.
And questioned the very concept of weightlessness in orbit, hearing the argument that it's actually a measurement illusion caused by weight increasing due to intensified ether interaction, but being undetectable from within the accelerating frame.
Then we tackled the giant of quantum mechanics, hearing the direct challenge to his postulates. Electrons reimagined as unique, definite pulsating bodies, not fuzzy clouds. Atoms filled with structured ether, not empty space.
And the proposal that atoms are indeed tiny solar systems where these unique electrons ride standing waves formed in the ether by the nucleus's pulsation residing at the antinodes, their energy changes and spectral emissions linked to jumps in the ether's variable density, with spectral lines perhaps reflecting underlying musical mathematical ratios in the ether structure itself.
We even touched upon Gravilides as macroquanta, magnetism as atomic deformation, and the electron's role in current being secondary to the lattice's pulsation. And finally, we glimpsed a completely different mathematical foundation.
Right. A math structured by the golden ratio and the infinite volumetric Russian matrix, assigning inherent numerical quantitative significances to physical properties and unifying physics through dimensionless invariants that always equal 1, reflecting the fundamental interconnected ratios governing reality.
It is. Well, it's a lot. A truly comprehensive alternative system built on principles that stand in stark, direct contrast to much of standard physics. A universe of pulsating, unique interconnected entities within a structured dynamic medium governed by elegant, intrinsic mathematical ratios.
And we want to be absolutely clear. We have done our absolute best today to simply navigate and present the author's views as found solely in the source material you provided. We've explored this incredibly fascinating, often bizarre, alternative perspective without imposing any judgment, endorsement, or dismissal of our own.
Our aim, as always in the deep dive, was simply to lay out these mind-bending ideas clearly as they were presented in the text you shared with us, trying to show how they construct a coherent, internally consistent, unified picture of nature based on this radically different foundation. Whether it reflects reality is a whole other question beyond our scope today.
And it definitely leaves us, and hopefully you, with so much to ponder, doesn't it? What if, just what if, the fundamental principles of the universe aren't what we've been taught at all? What if reality isn't built on empty space and abstract forces governed by complex equations, but on something more like dynamic, inherent pulsation, deep interconnectedness, and the elegant mathematical ratios found echoing throughout nature, like the golden ratio?
What does this profoundly different mechanical yet animated view imply about everything we see and experience? From the smallest subatomic flutter to the grandest cosmic ballet, how would it change our place in the cosmos?
It certainly opens the door to contemplating a universe that is perhaps even more mysterious, more intricately structured, and more dynamically alive than even our current standard models suggest. It's a perspective that challenges us to think differently about the very fabric of existence.
It truly does. A universe humming with its own internal rhythms.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing this genuinely thought-provoking and perspective-shifting source material with us. And thank you for joining us on this truly deep dive into Russian mechanics. It has been an absolutely fascinating and, yes, mind-bending exploration.
A singular look at a potentially different cosmos, indeed.
That's all the time we have for this deep dive today. We deeply appreciate you tuning in and trusting us to unpack these incredible, sometimes challenging sources. We'll catch you next time when we peel back the layers on another stack of material and hopefully find more surprising, often hidden insights within.
Until then, take care.